June 5th, 1944, northern France, the Normandy coast. 23:57 hours. The wind rolled in cold from the channel that night, carrying with it the damp weight of approaching tide and the faint metallic scent of machinery waiting in the dark. The beaches below lay silent, their sand black under moonless haze. Along the bluffs facing the water, the German Atlantic wall appeared still and immovable. Bunkers of thick reinforced concrete, corrugated steel doors, machine gun nests sunk into clay, observation posts perched atop cliffs like heavy stone eyes. Inside many of them, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and the dust of long-settled mortar. The men stationed here had grown used to waiting for orders, waiting for relief, waiting for an invasion they had been told would come, but only when the enemy could gather the strength to face such a fortified shore. High above, inside a coastal command villa near Caen, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studied the sea through a window left partially open to the night. The air stung with salt. Rommel had spent months reinforcing the coastal defences, ordering stakes planted in tidal flats to pierce landing craft, mines wired to the surf's edge, artillery batteries dug into slopes where they could fire without fear of swift counterattack. And yet Rommel was not here to witness what would come. He had left that morning to visit his wife for her birthday, believing that weather made an Allied landing impossible. The sea's current whispered below, constant and indifferent, shifting against rock as it had for centuries. The bunkers stood quiet under that same rhythm, unmoving, as if carved from the coast itself. Inside an underground command post at La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in Western Europe, reviewed situation reports drifting in from the coastline. Most seemed ordinary. Allied aerial reconnaissance, routine naval patrols, scattered partisan sabotage inland. Nothing spoke of invasion. Nothing warned of the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. Rundstedt, old and weary from balancing Hitler's demands against the reality of German depletion, leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He believed the moment of Allied assault would reveal itself in the thunder of engines and the flash of steel upon the sea. He believed the Atlantic wall, his wall, would test any force bold enough to strike it. What he did not yet know was that the first wave of the Allied assault had already begun, not with soldiers, but with artillery. Across the Channel, unseen in the darkness, an armada of nearly 15,000 Allied guns waited in silence. British Royal Artillery regiments, American Corps artillery groups, Canadian field batteries, naval destroyer main batteries, and battleship turrets holding shells the size of tree trunks, all stood ready, all loaded, all pointed east. On the decks of warships stretching from horizon to horizon, the shells were stacked in rows like silent promises, each one cold to the touch, each one a weight that would soon reshape coastlines and memory alike. Among the ships was the battleship USS Nevada, rescued from the flames of Pearl Harbor, refitted and newly armoured, its great 14-inch guns now aimed at the very shoreline once believed invulnerable. Nearby, the HMS Rodney, the same warship that had helped sink the Bismarck 3 years earlier, sat quiet in the swell, waiting for coordinates. In mobile fire control positions positioned in villages across southern England, officers of the Royal Artillery traced targets on transparent plotting sheets under dim red lamps. Among them was Brigadier H.J. Parham, a man whose voice rarely rose above measured calm, even when the order to fire meant shifting the fates of thousands. On the American side, artillery officers such as Brigadier General Charles P. Scott, commanding the 5th Corps' artillery, studied tide tables, wind forecasts, and coded signals. Their men had spent weeks calibrating firing tables, elevation, humidity, atmospheric pressure, charge temperature. Every variable mattered. These guns were not simply weapons. They were mathematics, physics, and timing harnessed into force. And just beyond the coastline, waiting in shadow, were the guns of the Allied naval bombardment groups. Destroyers, cruisers, and battleships prepared to fire in synchronized arcs. Fire control teams had rehearsed for this night so many times that commands no longer needed explanation. A phrase spoken into a headset, a number shouted down a steel ladder shaft, a bell rung once in a turret. Each motion drove the next. The gunners did not pace. They did not wonder. They waited. At midnight the sea was calm. The wind is low. The coastline is quiet. The German bunkers sat unshaken, their concrete firm beneath the weight of confidence and assumption. German officers believed the Atlantic Wall could withstand anything the Allies could throw at it. They believed the enemy would break upon the shore like thin surf. But the sea has a way of carrying more than water, and the air has a way of carrying sound before it carries flame. The first sign came as a tremor, so faint it might have been dismissed as the shifting of tidal rock, a low, distant rumble, like thunder rolling somewhere beyond clouds. German sentries paused, listening, but heard nothing more. The coastline remained still. The second sign came moments later, a second tremor, stronger now, moving through the ground itself. One artilleryman stationed near Longues-sur-Mer, Gefreiter Karl Weller, leaned forward, frowning, pressing his palm flat to the floor of the bunker. The concrete seemed to hum, a deep vibration, steady, growing. He opened his mouth to call out to the others, but the words never came. The horizon flashed, once, then again, then continuously. The guns had begun. 15,000 Allied barrels, naval and land-based, fired as one. The Atlantic Wall did not answer. It endured, and then it shook. Before sunrise, the outcome was already changing. Not in strategy, not in ideology, but in pressure, delivered from sea and sky. The German bunkers, once symbols of permanence, were about to learn what it meant to be struck not by bullets, but by the weight of an entire world choosing to move forward. Before the guns roared, before the first shells lit the horizon like a false sunrise, the German High Command believed it understood the nature of the coming battle. For 2 years, the construction of the Atlantic Wall had been carried out under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, men whose names carried weight in Berlin, and even among their enemies. They did not always agree. Rommel believed the invasion must be stopped at the waterline, that the first wave of Allied troops must be crushed before they could establish even a foothold. Rundstedt believed in depth, in pulling enemy forces inland and counter-attacking where their supply lines were stretched and exposed. The argument between them reflected a deeper divergence in German strategic thought. Rommel viewed the sea as the front line. Rundstedt viewed the plains of France as the real battlefield. But both men, despite their differences, believed in the Atlantic Wall as more than concrete and gun positions. They believed it was a statement of inevitability, that no invading army could break so fortified a boundary without tearing itself apart in the process. German leadership had been shaped by earlier victories, where firepower and discipline had broken enemies quickly. The fall of France in 1940 had been swift, decisive, almost theatrical in its overturning of expectations. The Wehrmacht had not only demonstrated speed and cohesion, it had demonstrated the ability to rewrite assumptions about how war was fought. The same confidence lingered in the coastal defences. The concrete bunkers built into cliffs and dunes were angled to deflect incoming fire. Observation posts commanded clear lines of sight along beaches where the tide could strand landing craft. Barbed wire rolled across the beachfront in dense nets. Anti-tank obstacles shaped like massive metal crosses were planted deep in sand. Mines lined the edge of the tide. Artillery batteries such as the one at Longues-sur-Mer were positioned where they could fire inland as well as outward. German engineers believed they had accounted for every approach. They believed that the Atlantic Wall, if it did not stop the Allies entirely, would at least bleed them so severely that the invasion would become unsustainable. The confidence of the German leadership was reinforced by intelligence assessments delivered to them in the months leading to the invasion. British deception operations, particularly Operation Fortitude, had successfully convinced the German High Command that the primary Allied landing would take place at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between Britain and France. The deception was supported by false radio traffic, dummy armoured divisions, inflatable tanks positioned for reconnaissance planes to observe, and agents feeding consistent misinformation. German analysts interpreted every signal through the lens of expectation. They believed the Allies would land where logic dictated, the shortest crossing. The Normandy coast was heavily defended, yes, but not to the degree Rommel wished. Rundstedt argued that reserves must remain inland in case of a second landing. Berlin agreed with him. The result was that the defences at Normandy were strong enough to kill many men, but not strong enough to prevent landing if the Allies committed to endurance rather than speed. In the bunkers and coastal artillery positions themselves, the belief in German strength was felt more viscerally. Men like Gefreiter Karl Weller, The artillerymen stationed at Longues-sur-Mer had spent months maintaining gun barrels, cleaning bearings, and checking fuse mechanisms. They drilled fire coordination exercises so often that the commands became instinctive, spoken in clipped German cadence, the voice of their battery commander echoing through narrow corridors. They had little reason to doubt their position. The concrete overhead was meters thick. The embrasures through which their guns would fire were reinforced and angled. The guns themselves, 105mm and 155mm artillery pieces, had proven themselves against armoured columns in Russia and North Africa. The Atlantic Wall was not merely a defensive line. It was a belief that the Germans had mastered the art of fortification. German officers believed that the Allies would hesitate, that the cost of landing under fire would break their resolve. They believed the first wave of soldiers would be trapped on beaches with no cover, forced to crawl over sand and wire under machine gun fire. They believed the artillery would fire in pre-calibrated patterns designed to overlap and sweep. They believed the sea itself was their ally, that tide and surf would scatter the enemy. They believed that Allied naval guns, no matter how large, could not sustain continuous fire at a single point long enough to shatter reinforced concrete. They believed their crews, trained and hardened by years of war, would hold under bombardment. They believed the bunkers were strong enough to endure anything short of direct demolition charges placed by engineers on the doors themselves. Belief became an atmosphere. It shaped how watch rotations were scheduled. It shaped how ammunition was stored. It shaped where officers chose to sleep and where they chose to inspect. Confidence was a kind of blindness, but it was not arrogance without foundation. The Atlantic Wall looked impenetrable. It felt immovable. The men stationed along its length believed they were the shield of Europe. Above all, the German High Command believed that artillery, their artillery, would decide the moment of invasion. They believed that the thunder of German guns would answer any challenge from sea or sky. The bunkers were designed to withstand bombardment long enough for German batteries to adjust and return fire. The Atlantic Wall was built with the expectation that the Germans could and would fire longer, harder, and more precisely than any invading force. They believed the enemy would break before the concrete did. But the Allied bombardment that was about to begin was unlike any artillery operation the world had ever seen. It was not local. It was not tactical. It was not meant to destroy troops. It was meant to shatter the very idea of permanence. 15,000 guns. Naval guns firing shells weighing more than a man. Field guns laid in endless batteries along English coastlines. Self-propelled artillery waiting offshore on landing craft to roll onto beaches and fire immediately. Rocket ships prepared to saturate beaches with explosions measured in acres, not meters. The Germans believed they understood artillery. They believed they understood fortification. They believed concrete could outlast fire. They had not yet learned what it meant when an entire continent's industrial power was aimed at a single shoreline. They thought they were preparing for a battle. They were preparing for a redefinition of force. When the guns finally fired, the German soldiers in the bunkers would not simply hear the shells. They would feel the earth itself recoil. Expectation would collapse not in argument, but in vibration, the kind that travels through sand, steel, and bone. The first shock arrived before the first man could name it. It travelled not through the air, but through the ground. In the bunkers lining the Norman coast, men awakened not to sound, but to vibration. The concrete beneath them trembled faintly at first, like a distant train rumbling somewhere below the surface of the earth. The midnight air was still, the sea invisible in the darkness, the sky overcast and without starlight. Sentries leaned forward, listening, unsure whether their ears or imagination had stirred them from their fatigue. But then the second tremor came, and this one was stronger, rolling up from the soles of their boots to the bones of their legs. A few loose stones rattled in mortar seams. A metal cup on a table jingled softly. The earth was speaking before the sky had found its voice. Inside the battery at Longues-sur-Mer, Hauptmann Werner Pluskat lifted his head slowly, his vision still blurred from only moments of uneasy sleep. He had lived through bombardments in North Africa and had felt artillery fire in the fields near Smolensk, but this was different. This was continuous. It was not a single shockwave of attack, not an exchange of shells, but a deep rolling tremor that seemed to have no beginning and no end. He crossed the bunker to the observation slit and peered out, but saw only darkness. No flares, no lights, no silhouettes. The sensation of motion without sound unsettled him more than any scream of incoming fire. There was something vast behind it, something approaching. Beyond the coastline, across 20 miles of cold black water, the Allied fleet had begun to fire. Battleships and cruisers stood far offshore, their guns elevated at steep angles, their shells rising high into the night sky before descending in bald arcs toward the French shoreline. Destroyers in closer waters fired in rapid cycles, pausing only long enough to correct elevation before releasing another round. The firing was not chaotic. It was measured, timed, synchronized, layered. The sea lit up in flickering flashes that were visible only when haze broke. The shells themselves could not yet be seen, but their arrival was registered in earth, sand, and concrete. The first detonation struck inland, not the bunkers themselves, but the junctions, crossroads, supply paths, and telegraph stations that connected the German coastal defence to its rear support structure. Command posts in small towns behind the beaches lost communication within minutes. Telephones fell silent. Radios dissolved into static. A colonel at Bernier attempted to signal the 716th Infantry Division headquarters and found every line dead. The defences of Normandy had not yet been attacked, but they had already been isolated. This was not bombardment to soften a landing. This was bombardment to unravel an army before it could respond. At Pointe du Hoc, the cliffside did not merely shake, the cliffside moved. Huge chunks of chalk broke free under impact and plunged into the surf below. Gun crews, who had sworn that concrete thicker than 2 meters could survive any naval shell, watched cracks spread across ceilings in jagged branching lines. Dust filled the air with a taste of plaster and salt. A young loader named Franz Weber stared at the wall in front of him and realized, as he saw dust fall in slow thin streams, that the ceiling itself was flexing. He had believed the bunker immovable. It had never occurred to him that the rock it stood on could be reshaped. Out to sea, aboard the British cruiser Staree MS Belfast, Captain Frederick Parham stood behind the fire control plotting table. He wore headphones and spoke calmly into the microphone, adjusting bearing and timing as if conducting a rehearsal, rather than orchestrating the largest naval bombardment in human memory. There was no adrenaline in his voice, no raised pitch. The firing cycle was a procedure. The mathematics of destruction were already solved. 2 gunners below him operated elevation and traverse wheels, their muscles repeating movements learned through endless drills. They did not need to see the coastline to understand the effect their guns were having. In the American sector, Brigadier General Charles P. Scott of the Corps Artillery coordinated the inland barrage that would follow the naval guns. His staff worked around a long table marked with grease pencil lines and transparent overlays. They adjusted for wind at altitude, humidity at deck level, barrel wear and powder temperature. Every correction ensured that when naval fire lifted, field artillery would begin without pause. The barrage was not one wave. It was a chain reaction. No silence allowed. No recovery allowed. No breathing space for the men in the bunkers. German soldiers expected sound. They expected thunder, blasts, concussion waves that struck eardrums and chests. But what arrived was stranger. The sensation that the world beneath them was loosening. The ground did not simply shake. It vibrated continuously, as if every grain of sand and every shard of rock had begun trembling independently. Some men held their helmets. Others pressed palms against walls to feel the movement. A few shouted orders that no one heard through the rolling pressure. It was not noise that overwhelmed them. It was the absence of silence. Pluscat tried to contact his superior officers. The lines were gone. He tried to reach division command. Nothing. He tried to send a runner, but stepping outside the bunker meant walking into a world in which the very air seemed thick with falling dust and pulverized earth. He realized the truth before anyone said it aloud. They could not coordinate fire. They could not request support. They could not adjust their guns to counter the naval barrage. They were alone, fortified but isolated, strong but unconnected. Strength without connection is simply a box. As the bombardment continued, one understanding spread through the bunkers like a chill. The Atlantic Wall had not been built to withstand this. Not this duration. Not this scale. Not this synchronization. The men inside had believed that concrete made them invulnerable. But the contradiction arrived in the form of vibration, in the form of isolation, in the form of the realization that the enemy was not attacking the bunkers. The enemy was attacking the idea that the bunkers mattered. The first shock was not the destruction of the Atlantic Wall. The first shock was realizing it was not a wall at all. It was only material, and material can be changed. When dawn finally began to ease its way into the sky, the scale of the assault revealed itself not in sound, but in sight. The horizon was no longer a clean line separating sea from sky. It had become layered, dense, almost architectural. Warships of every size filled the channel in formations so vast that the sea appeared as though it had grown a metallic skin. To the men on the French coast, it seemed impossible that so many vessels could exist at once, let alone move in coordination. Yet the Allied fleets had not arrived overnight. They had been assembled over months, drawn from shipyards across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, from the harbours of Plymouth and Portsmouth to the naval docks at Rosyth and Scapa Flow. The numerical scale of the invasion defied ordinary comprehension. Nearly 7,000 vessels, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop ships, tank landing ships, supply barges, repair craft, minesweepers, hospital ships, and towing craft carrying artificial harbour components. The ocean did not look like a battlefield. It looked like an entire civilization moving in formation. And above that civilization came another. As the naval bombardment continued, the air over the channel filled with aircraft. Bombers, fighter escorts, airborne reconnaissance planes, and glider tugs moved in steady corridors across the sky. At first, their silhouettes were faint in the dawn haze, but as light strengthened, their scale became undeniable. Hundreds became thousands. The air itself had been assigned a direction of travel. The coordination required to maintain such movement would have been impossible only a few years earlier. Now, in 1944, Allied command and control infrastructure had finally reached a maturity that allowed multiple air forces to operate over one battlefield without interfering with one another. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces flew in layered altitude bands. Heavy bombers moved at the highest altitudes, medium bombers and fighter bombers below them, and fighters weaving in protective arcs beneath. The skies over Normandy on June 6th held over 11,000 Allied aircraft. There were so many that the Germans could not count them, and in truth, no one on the ground could. This was escalation not only in numbers, but in structure. Every ship, every gun, every aircraft, every landing craft belonged to a sequence. Naval guns would fire, then lift. Field artillery would begin, air strikes would pass, then the landing craft would approach. Behind them, amphibious armoured vehicles. Behind them, waves of infantry. Behind them, tanks. Behind them, engineers. Behind them, headquarters staff. Behind them, mobile supply convoys. The invasion did not arrive as a single thrust. It arrived as a tide system. If one wave failed, the next would surpass it. If the next fell back, another would arrive behind it. The assault on the coastline was not dependent on a moment of success. It was dependent on accumulation. This accumulation had been made possible through an industrial scale of production the world had never seen before. In American foundries, shells were manufactured by the millions. The United States alone had produced over 41 billion rounds of ammunition by 1944, and that number continued to grow. Tanks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit and Chicago. Landing craft were mass-produced in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast. Naval guns were cast in heavy steel mills in Pennsylvania and shipped to shipyards on both coasts. Merchant ships had been built faster than German submarines could sink them. The German soldiers on the Atlantic Wall believed they were facing an army. In reality, they were facing an economy. Field gun positions inland, such as those commanded by Brigadier General Charles B. Scott, represented this reality clearly. Batteries of 105mm and 155mm guns had been positioned in the countryside of southern England weeks before the invasion. Their crews had practiced firing without line of sight, moving solely by map coordinates relayed from forward observers and aerial photography. By the morning of June 6th, these guns fired in synchronization with the naval guns offshore. Land and sea were no longer separate forces. They were a single system of pressure arranged to compress the coastline. The escalation extended beyond artillery and aircraft. Behind the first waves of troops lay the engineering solution that would enable the invasion to survive: the Mulberry harbours and the pipelines under the sea. These were not weapons, they were infrastructure. Engineers had built massive floating harbour sections, caissons, pontoons, piers, and breakwaters that could be towed across the channel and assembled into functioning ports on beaches that had no natural harbours. Without ports, supplies would bottleneck and the invasion would starve. With them, an army could grow on foreign soil. The mulberries represented an engineering feat on the scale of the pyramids, constructed not over decades but months. German intelligence had never detected them. The Germans were learning that war was no longer measured in tactics alone. It was measured in the ability to move fuel, ammunition, spare parts and replacements across oceans. The Allies had built not simply an invasion force but a logistical bloodstream. The numbers reflected this clearly. By the end of D-Day, over 156,000 troops would be ashore. Within 10 days, that number would exceed 500,000. Within a month, it would surpass 1 million. And behind every one of those men came everything they would need to function. Artillery shells, food, medical supplies, vehicles, fuel, replacement rifles, spare parts for trucks, bandages, field stoves, tents, radios, and millions of feet of telephone wire. The Allied command understood that war was not won where the fighting occurred. It was won where the replacement arrived. On the German side, no such scale existed any longer. The Eastern Front had consumed enormous resources. Fuel was scarce. Tank units in France often lacked spare parts. Reinforcement divisions existed on paper but not in full. And perhaps most damning of all, the German command system was too centralized. Units could not reposition without direct authorization from High Command. And High Command, constrained by deception and misinformation, believed the landing at Normandy was a diversion. As the shelling continued, the German commanders faced a new awareness. They were not facing an opponent who intended to match them, blow for blow. They were facing an opponent who intended to drown them in momentum. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to repel a direct assault. But the invasion was not a direct assault. It was the imposition of accumulated force, the weight of entire societies, technologies, factories, and fields of harvested grain being placed on one shoreline. This was escalation in its purest form. Not speed, not fury, but inevitability. What shook the bunkers was not just artillery. It was the realization that the war had already moved beyond them. The turning point arrived quietly, not in the roar of the guns, but in the moment when German officers realized the meaning behind the bombardment. It was not intended to destroy every bunker, nor to kill every defender on the shoreline. It was intended to break the lines that connected them. In the underground command bunker of the 352nd Infantry Division, General Dietrich Kreis awaited situation updates from his coastal batteries. One by one, the reports ceased. Telephones clicked without connection. Runners did not return. Radio frequencies dissolved into static or silence. Kreis stood beside the operations table, his hand resting on the worn edge of a map annotated in blue and red grease pencil, and understood that he no longer commanded a cohesive defence. He commanded fragments. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, had depended on communication. With communication severed, it was no longer a wall. It was a scattering of isolated strongpoints, and strongpoints, when isolated, do not stop armies. They are simply islands waiting to be bypassed or buried. Along the cliffs near the village of Colleville-sur-Mer, Hauptmann Werner Pluskat also began to understand this shift. Smoke obscured the sea, the horizon pulsed with flickers of flame from naval guns firing in rhythmic intervals. His battery had survived the initial bombardment, though at cost. Some of his men were dazed, one bleeding from the ear, another staring with unfocused eyes as though listening to something no one else could hear. Pluskat lifted his binoculars to the water again. The view that had been concealed by night and haze now revealed itself in full. Landing craft, hundreds of them. They moved in waves, formations drawn not by individual choice but by months of planning. They were coming directly toward the beaches his division had been assigned to defend. The bombardment had not been the attack. It had been the preparation to ensure that when the defenders fired, they would fire alone, without support, without reinforcement, without instruction. What had been certainty now thinned into fear. The turning point deepened inland. In Caen, General Marx of the 84th Army Corps attempted to organize a counterattack. His staff officers traced routes for armoured divisions to move toward the beaches, but those routes required crossing bridges, and the bridges had been destroyed in the opening hours by Allied aircraft and French resistance sabotage. Roads were cratered, fuel was limited. Even if tanks could reach the coast, they would arrive in small numbers and under air attack. Marx read the situation maps, knowing he was watching the unravelling of his sector. He had once warned Berlin that the Atlantic Wall could not hold indefinitely. Now he saw that it was failing before the counterattack could even begin. Far to the south, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, informed of the invasion only after it was underway, attempted to request permission to release the armoured reserves stationed near Paris. He believed the only chance to contain the Allies was to strike fast before the invaders established a secure beachhead, but releasing the armoured divisions required authorization from Adolf Hitler. And Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. Rundstedt paced the floor of his command room, knowing the hours slipping away were time the defenders did not possess. Every minute of delay strengthened the Allied foothold. Every minute of silence from Berlin pushed the coastline closer to collapse. Rundstedt, who had once believed in counterattack as a principle of war, now realized he no longer commanded. The chain of command that had once enabled lightning warfare in 1940 now bound the German army in paralysis. Meanwhile, in the village of Vimoutiers, Erwin Rommel hurried back toward Normandy after receiving news of the bombardment. His staff car cut through rainy roads. Rommel had argued that the Germans must meet the invasion at the shoreline. He had begged for armoured divisions to be stationed closer to the coast. He had warned that Allied air superiority would prevent any counterattack once troops were ashore. Now, as he drove through the countryside he had studied so carefully, he saw the sky filled with Allied aircraft. Fighters patrolled in lazy circles. Bombers moved in higher streams. Every road that led toward the coast risked attack. Rommel pressed his hand to his forehead, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. He had not misjudged the enemy. He had misjudged the willingness of his superiors to believe him. On the beaches themselves, the turning point took the form of human movement. The first waves of Allied soldiers had suffered terribly. Many had died before reaching sand. Others drowned in the surf. But those who reached the shore crawled forward, inch by inch, using shingle, crater and dune for cover. Engineers cleared lanes through barbed wire with torpedoes and explosives. Soldiers fired blindly into smoke, into pillbox slits, into sound. The German defenders fought hard. Machine gun nests at Omaha Beach cut down entire ranks of advancing infantry. Mortar crews fired until their barrels glowed. But for every man who fell, another arrived, and another, and another. The German defenders were killing, but they were not stopping the advance. The numbers were too great. No matter how accurate their fire, the tide continued. At the Pointe du Hoc cliffs, American Rangers began climbing the vertical rock faces under fire, digging steel grappling hooks into stone still shaking from bombardment. German soldiers leaned over the cliff edge and fired downward, but the Rangers climbed through bullets and falling rock. When they reached the top, they fought bunker to bunker in close, brutal combat. The guns at Pointe du Hoc had been moved inland days earlier. The Rangers had not climbed to destroy artillery. They had climbed to ensure the artillery could never be restored to its original position. Climbing under fire had not been a tactical necessity. It had been a statement of intent. And then came the realization that changed the balance of the battlefield more than any orders from Berlin or London. The German soldiers inside the bunkers could not rotate. They could not withdraw. They could not maneuver. They could only fire from static positions. The Allies, once ashore, could move anywhere. The defenders were fixed. The attackers were fluid. Everything the Atlantic Wall had been built to represent became its weakness. By midday on June 6th, the German officers who had believed so deeply in the permanence of the wall understood the truth. Strength without movement is not strength. It is confinement. The turning point was not the moment the Allies took the beaches. It was the moment the German command realized they could not take them back. The bunkers continued to stand, but the outcome inside them had already shifted. The war had changed from one of defence to one of endurance, and endurance favoured the side that could replace what it lost. The Atlantic Wall had not been broken in the way walls usually fall. It had been overtaken by time, by numbers, by movement, and by the refusal of an army to stop. In the hours after the landings, the beaches no longer felt like beaches at all. The tide carried debris to shore: helmets, broken rifles, floating crates, lifebelts, splintered wood, and the quiet, innumerable markers of those who no longer moved. Smoke hung low, pulled sideways by the wind rolling in from the channel. The sea itself seemed exhausted, its waves heavy and slow, as if burdened by what they had carried. Yet among the wreckage came order. Engineers began clearing lanes through mines. Medical teams moved between the wounded, speaking quietly, even while shells whistled overhead. Radio operators held antennas upright with one hand while tuning frequencies with the other. The invasion force did not pause to acknowledge the cost. It continued forward because stopping meant returning to the sea, and there was no return. This was the moment when the beaches of Normandy ceased to be a place and became a threshold. The question was no longer whether the Allies could land. The question was whether they could hold. By evening, staging points began to form. At Omaha Beach, where casualties had been heaviest, soldiers clustered behind the cover of bluffs and dunes. Units that had lost officers appointed replacements from among surviving sergeants and corporals. Command did not exist as a single hierarchy anymore. It existed in fragments that continued to move because no one could afford to be still. Inland, at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces advanced through fields and orchards, weaving around farmhouses and stone walls. They were pushing toward the town of Caen, where German resistance was expected to concentrate. The fields of Normandy, once quiet under the soft wind, were now crossed by armoured personnel carriers and columns of infantry speaking languages the villagers had not heard in years. Overhead, Allied fighters patrolled ceaselessly, ensuring that any German armoured column that attempted to form would be struck before it could gather momentum. The German defenders, once confident in the Atlantic Wall's ability to absorb the invasion, now found themselves in a landscape that no longer matched their maps. Roads that had been clear in the morning were now cratered. Strong points that had once been connected by telephones were isolated by collapsed communication trenches. Entire companies discovered that units they believed anchored on their flanks had either been overrun or forced to withdraw. Orders carried by runners arrived too late. Counterattacks launched by isolated platoons broke like waves on stone. Some German units fought with grim determination, firing until their ammunition was gone, and then withdrawing into hedgerows to fight again. Others surrendered when they realized they had been cut off. What defined the German resistance that day was not uniform collapse, but fragmentation. The army fought as individuals, as crews, as surviving pockets, not as an integrated whole. General Marx attempted to establish a defensive line along the Caen-Bayeux road, believing that if the Allies were prevented from expanding, they might be contained. But the road itself was under constant air attack. Columns of the 21st Panzer Division attempted to form south of Caen. They moved through orchards and along hedgerows to avoid detection. They succeeded only for a moment. As they emerged to strike toward the beaches, they were seen by a single Allied reconnaissance pilot. Within minutes, squadrons of fighter bombers descended, strafing and bombing the armoured column until it broke and scattered. Rommel's warning had come true. Once the Allies were ashore, German armoured counterattacks would be shattered by aircraft before they reached their objectives. The battlefield no longer belonged to ground forces. It belonged to whoever controlled the air, and the air was owned by the Allies. Inside the German command structure, a second collapse unfolded. Rundstedt renewed his request to release the armoured reserves. He was denied until the afternoon, long after the critical window had passed. When permission finally came, units began moving, but fuel shortages slowed them. Roadblocks and resistance sabotage further delayed them, and every mile closer to the coast brought increasing Allied airstrikes. Rommel, having reached the front, surveyed the situation personally and recognized the shape of the war that now lay before him. The war had ceased to be a maneuver. It had ceased to be flexible. It had become a struggle of attrition against an enemy with greater material depth and greater capacity to sustain loss. Rommel did not hide his assessment when speaking to his staff. He said plainly, "The enemy's air superiority alone makes it impossible for us to move. The enemy has prepared this for months. We are fighting a battle of material, and we do not have enough." The German soldiers still inside bunkers were the last to understand what had happened. The concrete around them still stood, cracked but intact. Their machine guns still fired. Their artillery still answered when it could. But when they looked to their flanks and saw no reinforcements, when they listened for orders and heard none, when they waited for resupply that never arrived, realization settled like dust in the narrow corridors. They had not been defeated by being overwhelmed. They had been defeated by being overtaken. The strength of a fortification lies not in its walls, but in the army that supports it, and the army that supported the Atlantic Wall no longer existed as a single entity. It had dissolved under the weight of bombardment, sabotage, miscommunication, and the speed of Allied establishment. By nightfall the beaches had become ports. Engineers drove stakes into the sand to anchor prefabricated pier sections. Landing craft shuttled back and forth, ferrying supplies and wounded alike. Medical tents rose in wind-carved depressions behind dunes. Chaplains knelt beside men whose eyes stared but did not see. The sea continued to roll in, as it always had, but now its rhythm matched the rhythm of engines, of wheels, of movement inland. In the villages beyond the beach, farmers watched columns of unfamiliar troops pass beneath fruit trees and stone archways. Some watched silently, some cried, some simply stood with hands over mouths. They had not known whether liberation would ever come. Now it had arrived in the shape of dust rising from boots and tracks. The aftermath of the bombardment and landings was not a stillness. It was a shift, a boundary crossed. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German permanence, now existed only as broken shapes of concrete on a coastline that no longer belonged to the Reich. The coast itself was being rewritten. Roads were being widened. Fields were being converted into temporary airstrips. The landscape was transforming not slowly but daily, by thousands of hands working without pause. War had moved inland, and the sea no longer separated worlds. It connected them. The bunkers remained on the shore, silent and heavy. But their silence was no longer watchful. It was the silence of structures that no longer held purpose. The battle for France would continue for months. Villages would change hands, fields would burn, towns would be destroyed and rebuilt, lives would be altered in ways that could not yet be understood. But one thing had already ended, and would not return: the belief that the Atlantic Wall could hold. It had not crumbled in an instant. It had been surpassed. The turning of the war had not occurred when the bunkers were captured. It had occurred the moment the Allies established themselves on the beaches faster than the Germans could remove them. History does not remember the strength that remains still. It remembers strength that endures motion. And the motion had begun. The meaning of the fall of the Atlantic Wall did not reveal itself on June 6th, nor in the days immediately afterward when the fields of Normandy churned with armour, infantry, and the smoke of burning wheat. Meaning is rarely visible during the moment of violence. It emerges later, when the bodies have been buried, when the guns have cooled, when the maps have been folded and replaced. Only after the noise subsides does the shape of a turning point become clear. For the Atlantic Wall, the meaning did not reside in whether this bunker held or whether that battery fell. It resided in the fact that the wall itself had been built upon a belief about war that no longer held true. The Germans believed that war was a matter of fixed positions, of strong points, of fortification. The Allies proved that war had become a matter of movement, supply, industry and coordination that stretched across seas, continents and skies. The guns that shook the bunkers were not merely weapons. They were the expression of an entire world choosing to act at the same time. General Dietrich Kreis, standing over his map table during the first hours of the invasion, understood this before he could articulate it. When his telephone lines went dead, when his artillery fire coordination dissolved, he saw that the wall had not been bypassed by force alone. It had been bypassed by the collapse of communication, and communication had collapsed because the Allies had prepared to destroy not men, not fortresses, but the connections that made them function. Kreis would continue to command his forces in the weeks that followed, fighting in hedgerow country and directing desperate defensive actions across small villages whose names were unknown to most outside Normandy. But he never regained coherence. He fought battles, but he no longer fought a war. The war had moved beyond him when the bunkers began to shake. Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, the artillery officer who had first seen the invasion fleet through binoculars at dawn, would later reflect in interrogation that the moment the horizon filled with ships, he understood that the meaning of the day had nothing to do with bravery or cowardice. The German defenders were not weak. They were not untrained. They fought hard. Many fought to the last round, the last position, the last breath. But their effort was overwhelmed not by superior courage, but by superior connection. The invasion was the visible edge of a continent's production. The armies that landed were simply the final act of a sequence that had begun in factories, in training camps, in shipping lanes, in meeting rooms where maps of entire oceans were studied, revised, and rehearsed. The German defenders fought tactically, the Allies fought strategically. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel saw this meaning most clearly of all. When he inspected the beaches after the invasion, he did not focus on the destruction alone. The broken tanks, the wrecked vehicles, the drowned landing craft, the abandoned equipment scattered in the tide. These were not what he observed longest. He looked at the organisation that came behind it. He watched supply parties unloading crates. He watched engineers repairing damaged roads within hours of their capture. He watched trucks move inland carrying ammunition and fuel. He saw that the Allies had not landed a force, they had landed a system. Rommel understood in that moment that Germany's defeat was not written in the moment the first soldier stepped onto sand. It was written in the moment the first supply truck followed him. The Atlantic Wall represented the last major attempt in the war to freeze geography, to turn coastlines into destiny. But the meaning of the invasion was that geography could no longer dictate the outcome of conflict. The ocean had once functioned as a barrier that determined the speed of war, but aviation and industrial shipping had changed that. Once armies moved at the pace of rivers, now they moved at the pace of engines. The wall had been built for a war that no longer existed. The Allies were fighting a war defined by scale, infrastructure, and the ability to coordinate across thousands of miles. The Germans were fighting a war defined by position, strong points, and the assumption that fortification could shape history. Only one of these understandings could survive D-Day. There was also meaning in the way the wall fell. It did not crumble because it was poorly built. It did not fall because the men inside it lacked will. It fell because it could not adapt. The bunkers did not move. The guns could not reposition. The defenders had been placed where they were meant to stand, and once the battle began, they could not change their fate. The Allies, meanwhile, adjusted constantly. If one landing sector faltered, reinforcements flowed to it. If one corridor inland became jammed, engineers cut another. If armour could not move through a village, artillery cleared the way. The invasion did not rely on anyone's success. It was supported by the assumption of failure and the preparation to recover from it. The Germans prepared to repel one landing. The Allies prepared to refine 10. The meaning deepened further when the war continued past the beaches. The hedgerow battles, the fight for Caen, the breakout at Saint-Lô, the dash across France in Operation Cobra, all of these revealed that the invasion had never been about the coastline. The coastline had been a doorway. The real war was inland, where the Allies used logistics to build momentum faster than the Germans could counter. The wall had been the final hope to prevent that momentum from forming. Once breached, the war shifted irreversibly, and perhaps the greatest meaning came not from soldiers or officers, but from the people of Normandy. The villagers who watched the invasion unfold understood something with a clarity that armies sometimes cannot reach. Permanence is an illusion. Occupation had seemed unending. The bunkers had seemed immovable. The German patrols, the restrictions, the rationing, the silence imposed on towns. All of it had felt like a condition without end. And then the sea changed its shape. The ground shook. The wall fell. History pivoted not slowly, but in the rhythm of shells striking earth. In the years after the war, many of the bunkers remained. Some were left to crumble under salt wind and rain. Others were incorporated into farms, used as storage sheds, animal shelters, or foundations for new buildings. The Atlantic Wall, once the line meant to preserve an empire, became part of the rural landscape it had once overshadowed. The concrete endured, but its meaning did not. The wall had tried to define the world by saying this far and no farther. The Allied guns answered by saying the world moves and we move with it. Meaning, in the end, rests in the knowledge that no structure of steel or stone can resist time, motion, and will combined. The Atlantic Wall shook not because it was weak, but because the world itself had shifted under it. The battle for Normandy was not only a military event, it was the moment the shape of war changed. And the shape of war has not been the same since. Years later, when the coastline had long since healed into the quiet shape of grass and sand and low wind from the channel, the bunkers still remained. They did not stand as threats anymore, nor as guardians, nor even as scars. They stood simply as structures, weathered and worn, half sunk into dunes, half choked by wild vines that had grown without permission or guidance. Children played on them, climbing rusted steel ladders and peering out of firing slits that once commanded arcs of death. Farmers stored tools inside their thick walls, finding in them the simplest kind of utility. Some bunkers were left to crumble under salt wind and slow rain, their ceilings sagging where rebar had rusted and expanded like roots trying to burst through soil. They existed now as part of the landscape, neither honoured nor hated, simply present. The world around them had moved forward, and they remained reminders of a day when the coastline was not just a border, but a hinge on which the direction of history turned. There are mornings along the Normandy beaches where the sea mist rolls in low and pale, softening everything it touches. At such times the line between past and present seems thinner. The sand looks almost as it did in the early hours of June 6, 1944, before it was shaken by bombardment and marked by footprints that never returned. The waves still arrive in steady rhythm, as they did then, but their sound is calmer now, no longer drowned by the roar of naval guns. The wind carries only the scent of salt and dune grass, not the chemical sharpness of burned powder. And yet, something remains. No noise, not motion, not fear. Something quieter. A sense of memory that does not speak but waits. On some dawns, fishermen walking the waterline stop for a moment and simply look, as if listening for something just beyond the reach of the morning light. Perhaps they feel it. Perhaps they simply know. The men who fought along this coastline aged. Many returned home. Some returned to Normandy decades later, walking once again across the bluffs they had crossed under fire, or climbed with bleeding hands, or defended with every ounce of strength they had left. They came not in triumph, but in contemplation. At Omaha Beach, veterans of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stood together one June afternoon in the late 1960s, saying little, because there were no words that could connect that shore then with the shore they now saw. One of them, a former sergeant named John Coate, walked slowly toward the tide and let the salt water rise over his boots. He said only this: "We didn't think the sea would ever be quiet again." Then he turned and walked back to the dunes. German veterans also returned. Some did so secretly, not wishing to draw attention. Others came in plain sight, walking the ruins of the bunkers where they had once loaded shells, cleared misfires, or shouted range corrections through smoke and dust. A former gunner from Pointe du Hoc returned in the early 1970s. He stood by a firing embrasure, touched the wall that had once shielded him, and looked out over the sea. After a long silence, he said softly to the man beside him, "The sea was our horizon. We thought it protected us, but the sea brought them to us, and we did not understand how there was no bitterness in his voice, only the tired understanding of a man who had lived long enough to see certainty dissolve into memory." The land is remembered in other ways too. Fields where armoured columns fought grew wheat again. Orchards where paratroopers landed in the dark bloomed in spring. Roads that had been cratered were repaved. The scars of trenches faded under grass. The villages rebuilt homes stone by stone, tile by tile. New children were born who knew nothing of blackout curtains or German patrol boots on cobblestone. Life returned, not in defiance, but in continuation, as life always does. Yet memory lived quietly in the corners. A barn wall still carried bullet marks. A church steeple leaned slightly where shrapnel had struck it. A hedgerow still followed the curve of an old foxhole line. These were not monuments, they were traces. Whispers of a day when the world changed its direction right here, in these fields. The meaning of the invasion did not remain only in history books or museums. It lived in the shape of how nations spoke to one another afterward. The war had revealed that no coastline was truly a boundary anymore. No ocean was too large to cross. No fortress was immune to the combined power of economies and industries acting in unison. The Atlantic Wall had been the last great attempt to fix the world in place, to decide where movement could and could not occur. But the world had moved, and it has continued to move ever since. Air travel, trade, alliances, diplomacy, reconstruction, all of it grew from the understanding that on that day, distance ceased to be a certainty. The sea no longer separated, it connected. For the people of Normandy, the legacy took a quieter shape. Every June, the tide still advances and retreats. The wind still moves through the tall grasses on the bluffs. Visitors walk the beaches in silence, feeling the weight of what happened without needing to see it. They stand on ground that holds memory not through monuments alone, but through presence. The coastline itself remembers. The land does not speak, but it does not forget. It simply holds what occurred here the way the sea holds its depths. And perhaps that is the truest reflection of all. History does not remain in the noise, it remains in the quiet afterward. The Atlantic Wall fell not in a spectacular collapse, but in a slow, solemn realization that nothing built to stop movement can endure a world that chooses to keep moving. The guns fell silent, the bunkers emptied, the invasion moved inland, the war shifted, and the coastline remained, carrying forward not the violence but the understanding that followed. If you walk the shore at twilight, when the sun lowers behind the horizon and the tide begins to pull back, you may notice something faint, something subtle, something almost like a breath beneath the wind. It is not the sound of battle. It is not the echo of cannon. It is the ocean, steady as it has always been, washing and withdrawing, as if reminding the world that change is constant and memory is carried not only in stone or steel, but in motion. The sea that once brought war now brings reflection. The coastline that once held fear now holds remembrance. And the bunkers that once signalled permanence now remind us that nothing is permanent at all.